right, hi and welcome to the Skeptical Leftist Podcast, the show where I talk to a variety of people to spread critical thinking, progressive politics, and left-wing philosophy. And today I'm joined by Matthew Facciani. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So, I guess we kind of mentioned it briefly before we recorded. We've spoken before, back in the old atheist days, when we were talking about social justice, because at that time it was like the SJWs and the anti-SJW.
Feels like a while ago now. Yeah, I mean, what a world it's been, and the change of the political discourse, but also online discourse, and then the atheist movement itself. That's a whole conversation.
Yeah.
It's all fascinating.
For sure. So I guess for anyone who might not know who you are, we better get an introduction out of the way. So who is Matthew Facciani?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a social scientist. I have a background across neuroscience, psychology, and sociology. And right now I'm a postdoc researcher at the University of Notre Dame in their computer science department. So I'm actually very interdisciplinary. I've worked across lots of different fields and broadly study the social and psychological forces that impact how we process information and form beliefs. And that falls into the category of misinformation research and misinformation studies. But the big picture is really about the social psychology of how we form beliefs and how we process information.
Sounds complicated.
It's a lot, but it's been fun. It's been cool to have all of these different perspectives and bring them all together in my research. It's been a long road. Was in grad school a long time as I kind of changed majors halfway through, but ultimately I enjoy what I do now, and it's fun to be able to research and talk about these topics. So
for sure,
it all worked out.
Right on. Something I'm curious about, and I've got a few kind of prepared ideas to discuss, but something that just struck me was I know years ago I read Michael Shermer's Why People Believe Weird Things, and I'm curious how well does stuff like that hold up? That kind of idea that people form these beliefs before they think about them in a way, and then they confirm them after the fact.
Yeah, I mean, the general concept of confirmation bias has been around a long time, and we've studied social influence on beliefs for decades. So those ideas are not new and have been approached by a variety of social scientists over the last 50 years or so. And even the idea of misinformation isn't that new. It was popularized into literature, like the academic literature in the 80s, when they talked about this misinformation effect for memory and how you could bias people's memories by showing them false information after the fact, and they would think they remembered something differently. So these topics of how beliefs form and how people's perception of information can change has been discussed for a long time. It's just more recently with our media environment and the political environment in the United States, especially, there's been more of this focus on misinformation and fake news and disinformation. But the ideas of bias, confirmation bias, and stuff like that has been studied for a very long time.
Yeah, I suppose that's one of those cognitive biasy things that kind of is ingrained in pretty much everybody, but we all kind of have to deal with it in some way.
Yeah, it definitely affects everybody. We're all susceptible to misinformation. And the approach that I take is looking at the social forces that guide our beliefs and the social identities that we have and how we have this motivation to protect those social identities. And that might mean interpreting information in a way that isn't always the most evidence-based. So You can think about a sports team. You might want to support your sports team. And if you see the referee make a call, you might think it's biased against your team. And that's kind of a benign example, but it's similar to what happens with political groups. If you have a political group you really identify with and you see some information that attacks that group, and that political group really means a lot to you, then it feels like a personal attack and you want to defend it. So you might interpret the information a little differently.
Yeah, for sure. I I know, like, because I identify as an anarchist. So I
Hmm.
often feel that way when I see people being like, especially when it's like people I would consider all allies in other ways, like
Hmm.
Marxist Leninists, for example. They like to talk down to anarchists, and I like to be like, hold on, you guys are wrong in a variety of ways. But yeah, some of that's almost for sure me engaging in confirmation bias.
Yeah, I mean, we all have groups we align with, and in the United States, there's a very clear red team, blue team, so it makes it easy to conceptualize and study. But this identity process impacts us for any social group we belong to, whether it's political identity or just how we see ourselves. We derive a lot of self-esteem from these identities,
Yeah.
and the risk is if we are too over reliant on a single identity or a single set of identities that are very have a ton of overlap, then we're so motivated to protect that narrow set of identities that any kind of information feels like such an attack, and we're very much likely to not process things objectively.
So I guess that kind of plays into a lot of like the current back and forth right now with like a lot of white, straight men feeling really attacked by like a lot of like progressive movements.
Yeah, I mean, it can be depending on how they form their identities, how they think about themselves. If they feel like, all of their political identity, like if they have a political identity where, like, one extreme example to keep it simple is like if your political identity very much aligns with your religious identity, and there's no disconnect there, and all of your friends and people that you associate with all share those beliefs, and
Mm,
let's say you think of yourself as like a contrarian type person, all of those things overlap, all of those identities share a lot of meanings, and they reinforce themselves,
yeah.
and you have such a strong motivation to protect that set of identities that anything that challenges that, whether it's progressive politics, if you happen to be conservative, or just change in any way, it can be very difficult and it can be very scary. So you might have a very strong negative response to information that challenges you.
Yeah, for sure. I yeah, it almost seems like that you see a lot of that even like on the what like I guess we see a lot on the Republican side of politics, but there's also I don't know, like a group of people who identify as Democrats that also are engaged in this sort of behavior quite a bit. Like you see like election denialism after the recent election.
Yeah, I mean that's the example that I think has been most salient recently. Um, I haven't seen any evidence that this past presidential election had any foul play or had any meaningful widespread election fraud, and yet there's a decent amount of Democrats. I mean, some polls have shown like 25-30% think that
Wow,
there was some kind of foul play, and
that's
some very
crazy.
prominent accounts. Yeah, so it's interesting to see like this when you look at the partisan split on the right and the left. You do see this kind of conspiratorial thinking that is motivated to protect that team so much. Um, and the important difference is that the Democrats, the elected politicians, haven't fed into that
Hmm.
as a contrast to some of the uh, top Republicans. But again, to the broader point, we're all susceptible to this, and you can see it across partisan lines for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Um, so I guess how does the like the media kind of play into this? Because I mean, everybody knows about Fox News, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what are some of the other kind of like maybe less obvious media things that are going on?
Yeah, I mean, media, for profit media, has an incentive structure. So they want to identify with their audience and basically tell their audience what they want to hear. And you can see this both on the right and the left, with MSNBC, as a very left leaning slant, for example. And, when you look at overall misleading claims, Fox News is often up there when you
Right.
look at all the legacy media. But I think by focusing so much on Fox News, sometimes Democrats do not pay as much attention to their own side. And especially, again, with legacy media, when they have this for-profit incentive structure, you're going to see this more sensationalized, misleading claims that are not necessarily overtly false, but the framing is presented in a way to make one side look good and one side look bad. So again,
Right.
it's that partisanship. So it's really tricky, and I think it's the risk is being so attached to one political party. So like you said, you identify as an anarchist. So I'm guessing that you're not as attached to one political party
Yeah, no,
as a
there's no
partisan.
parties I like, actually.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, so that's a way to protect yourself against at least that partisan slant is
Right.
if, I feel similarly with my own politics. I have political beliefs, of course, but I don't feel very attached to any partisan group.
Yeah.
And that gets me in trouble sometimes when I point out like, hey, like there's no election fraud that we saw in this last election. A lot of Democrats, commented like, oh, like it's very interesting because it's very similar. Like some of the comments were literally like, we're just asking questions. Like, how can you
Right.
prove there's no election fraud? I'm like, well, hold on. Is that like the same thing as what we just saw in 2020 that you were critical of? And there's a lot of emotions involved, and there's a lot at stake too. Like I don't want to be dismissive of how people feel about this. A lot of this has real impact. So
For sure.
when you have emotions and identities and all this stuff, like people might respond very strongly.
Yeah, it's I of course there's material effects to who's in office and the policies that they enact, right?
Right.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm not, obviously, if I had to pick a team, I would pick not Trump or not the conservatives. I think sometimes it's important to like keep a kind of a balanced look at things, like at least to like, because what's true should matter more than the team I picked, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I try to approach it. I think that's a good way to go about it. I mean, we're both skeptical individuals and both value critical thinking and evidence. And if one political party in the US focuses more on education, critical thinking, and telling the truth, then I'm going to align with that party.
Yeah, more so.
Yeah.
For sure. I guess we kind of jumped ahead in the conversation, but I want to know like how you got started on this path of researching and understanding misinformation.
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, my background is pretty interdisciplinary. I started out in cognitive neuroscience, so doing brain imaging stuff.
Oh,
So that was
yeah.
when I began grad school as fMRI and neural decoding. And my lone neuroscience publication was in this journal called Human Brain Mapping, where you try to like map, structures of brain activity or analyze those structures. And I was studying basically how people process different types of stimuli in this fMRI scanner. So you put them in the brain scanner, have them think about different stuff, and then see what lights up, essentially.
Okay.
And then from their brain activity alone, you can predict if they're thinking about a different type of emotion or a different type of object. And I thought that was really cool at the time. I still think it's really cool, but I got more interested in larger social issues and social problems and social psychology. I've always been interested in social influence on beliefs. Are you familiar with like the Solomon Asch studies, the conformity studies, and like?
Doesn't ring a bell. I know like the Stanford Prison Experiment, and I know like some of that stuff, but like
Yeah, it's kind of similar time period. The Solomon Asch studies I like because it's a very simple test of showing people these three lines. There's a variety of tasks that they did, but the simple one was you show people these three lines of different lengths, and then you say which of these lines is the same length as this other line that you see. And it's all on a screen. It's very easy. People get it correct like over 90% of the time. It's like really easy task to do. But the study was you have these people in a condition where they go in a room full of people that are actors. They don't know they're actors. And these actors all pretend they're also in the experiment, and they all give the wrong answer to this very easy task ahead of you. So if you watch like 9 or 10 people choose line B when you clearly see it's line A is the correct answer, then these researchers found that people were much more likely to give the wrong answer, even though it was super, super easy test. So like so it's that idea of conformity and social influence, I always found super fascinating because it's a purely social force that changes how we process information. So to get to your question, I found that fascinating and realized I wanted to study that. Even though I took kind of a detour in neuroscience, I was always interested in social psychology and beliefs. And thankfully, I was able to change graduate degrees within the same university. So I started my PhD in neuroscience, and then I finished it in sociology.
Oh, neat.
So I've kind of been all over. But when I finished my PhD, I was looking at political beliefs and social influence on political beliefs. And through that, I then studied political misinformation and health misinformation. And now I'm looking at media literacy and digital literacy. So it's kind of grown from that baseline interest in social influence on beliefs. And then that broadly is in this field of misinformation studies.
Okay. Is misinformation studies like a thing that you kind of coined, or is that like a broader thing?
It's a broader thing, yeah. So like I mentioned, like there's been the term misinformation has been an academic term for decades. This idea of just false or misleading information is just a broad way of studying how people process information in psychological literature and psychological studies. It's just been more recently, it's been popularized in the media, but it's always been an academic term in psychology.
Okay.
And but there are conferences and journals that do look at misinformation specifically. So it is a field of study, but it's such a broad term that there's some confusion about it, and sometimes it's politicized, unfortunately, and there's some misunderstandings about it.
I guess is it hard to like define what misinformation is? Because I know like everybody kind of has their own perspective on it, right?
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think it's really important to be very clear about how we're defining it in the studies. People that study it approach it from different angles. Sometimes it will be completely fabricated headlines. Sometimes it will be misleading headlines. How I've studied it before, sometimes I've just made up like political rumors. So one study I did, I asked people to evaluate a series of political rumors, such as like you hear a Democrat or a Republican has bullied another person. Like how likely are you to believe that story? So that's a form of misinformation via rumor. And then I've also analyzed headlines that are completely fake that demonize one political group or the other. So these are headlines that are real in the sense that they have spread around social media. Like someone made up these headlines, but they're not factual. Right. So one of the examples that I can remember is there was this headline spreading around a few years ago about Donald Trump Jr. He had the record for the most left swipes on Tinder. So kind of making so like trying to make fun of him. For those that don't use Tinder, that means not good. You swipe left, I believe. So like that's a false information because that was something that someone just made up. But if you are a Democrat, you might be more likely to believe that headline because you're like, I don't like this guy. So yeah, it's probably true. Like no one likes him either. So that's how I try to quantify it. But it is tough because when you call something misinformation, how I study it in my experiments, it's like clearly made up fake news headline. But you can also look at hyper partisan headlines or other stuff like that.
Right. Like, yeah, because sometimes even hyperbole, or over exaggeration, can be a kind of misinformation in a way.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a broad umbrella term. And I think we have to be really careful about when we delineate stuff as misinformation, because sometimes, there are evolving information cycles where we're learning about new stuff. And for me, I'm less interested in trying to call things misinformation or not and really focusing so much on like labeling stuff. I'm more interested in the narratives people have that can bias how they process information and form beliefs. That's kind of where I approach it from.
That's interesting. Yeah, I imagine if you're chasing down every false headline, you're going to be out there forever, right? Like you're never going
Right.
to get much done.
For sure.
Yeah, like so I guess what are some of the ways that like misinformation kind of spreads besides like it's the obvious, like on the news or headlines?
Yeah, so I mean, the news is a big one, and this is all different types of news. As we talked about before, like partisan legacy media, they have these political slants. So it's not always that they're completely lying. It's just they're presenting a very one-sided slant to the news story. So that's a big part of it. And then there are, fake news websites that just completely make up stuff that's just completely fabricated or so misleading that it's pretty much false.
Yeah.
And just social media posts. I mean, you could just log on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, and you can see these viral posts that someone made up that may or may not even be a real person, but it'll get thousands of likes or even millions of likes, depending on what platform, because it aligns with people's ideological priors. So they want to click on it and reshare it. So, that's definitely an issue, is the speed at which false information can spread, and just how there's such an asymmetry between making up stuff online and seeing it spread like wildfire, and then contrasting that with how much work it is to actually debunk something and fact check something and systematically break down, okay, here's why what that person said is not true, and all these studies you need to read. So it's really tough.
Yeah, I always have in my head that quote about the truth, the lie will travel around the world before the truth gets on its boots.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's spot on.
So I guess how does maybe it doesn't, but how does AI play into any of this at all?
I think it does, depending on how you think about it. So it definitely helps to which the scale of misinformation and disinformation can spread. So disinformation is just intentional false information. So, propaganda and stuff like that. So there's a clear goal, but it's always tough to know, or it's often tough to know people's intent. So I often just use misinformation as a broad umbrella term. But yeah, I mean, AI makes it so easy to make these chatbots that are creating these fake profiles. So before, if you used to see bot accounts on Facebook and Twitter in the old days, it was usually like poorly worded, weird things that they would share, these weird memes.
Right.
And now it's like really precise language, very persuasive language, and it can seem like a real person you're talking with. So the impact of these more sophisticated bots, it's still unclear like how much it actually can change someone's opinion. But it certainly pollutes the information environment. And there's just so much noise that I think the larger issue is it can make people distrust information more broadly and just be more cynical and kind of disconnected. I think that's one of the larger risks of AI polluting the information ecosystem.
Yeah, I sometimes think about like the way that people write. Like the way that I write, for a little while I used Grammarly to like check it for plagiarism, check it for AI type writing, and it thinks that I'm writing with an AI bot when I'm not. And I'm like, so if it thinks that my way of writing is an AI, how many people are being fooled by the actual AIs to think a certain thing or to be persuaded by a particular argument?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's unknown and we're still figuring out ways to identify it. Because you're right, a lot of this AI detection stuff is in its infancy and it doesn't really work that well. Um, so that's going to be a challenge trying to identify AI. I mean, I hope that we spend more resources on identifying manipulated images via AI. I know Meta is experimenting with like putting these little AI tags, but it's unclear like how well it's going to work or if
Right.
people are even going to pay attention to it. But ideally, we would agree as a society that we don't want these fake images completely made up through AI to be spreading all over the place and people having no idea to how they can determine if something is a real image or not.
Yeah, I remember like there was quite a slew of like images of I think Taylor Swift after the Super Bowl or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of people really disliked her, and so there was a lot of images of her online. And I think to some degree they were probably some of them were probably obvious, but maybe some of them weren't, and people were fooled into thinking this was like a real image.
Yeah, a lot of people definitely are fooled by it. Um, and I mean, you can just go on Facebook and see all kinds of clearly AI generated images, but then you'll see the comments, you'll see these people commenting on enough it's real. Um, like I'm sure you've seen some of this stuff. A lot of it is like religious imagery, like,
Yeah,
like a Jesus in a sandcastle or something. And you have all these boomers comment about how great it is.
yeah.
Um, so part of it's like a generational thing, but still it affects everyone. I think everyone's susceptible to this. And we can try to teach people how to recognize fake images, but the technology is becoming so sophisticated that even as we learn like little things to look for, it's always changing. So
That's
it's really
right.
tough.
Yeah, the better it gets, the harder it's going to be, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I remember looking at the deep fakes from a few years ago. I don't know, like 2019, 2020. I remember, and I'm like, oh, you can kind of tell it looks a little wonky. Like this doesn't quite match up. And then a few
Yeah.
years later, like the technology's so much better. It's like, oh, I actually can't really tell anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, so I guess people talk a lot about that AI slop, right? That is,
Hmm.
it's the quick stuff that you get thrown on Facebook or Twitter or whatever for a minute. But if somebody spends real time really working on something to create like a real deep fake, like I don't know if I'd be able to tell for sure.
Yeah, yeah. It's tough, and it's only going to get better. And it's part of it. It's like on one hand, it's really scary and very concerning. On the other hand, there's already such an inclination for people to want to believe what they want to believe. It's unclear how much AI is going to even add to that
Yeah,
because
that's true.
like you see people falling for like video game footage from like a Call of Duty, and they think it's like war footage that's in real
Right.
life.
Yeah.
And so like there's already like really cheap examples of these deep fakes with called cheap fakes of just or just imagery that's from something else, some other context. So I think the broader issue is more of why people are so inclined to believe things that are false that align with their priors, even more than just the AI slop out there.
So, why do you think that is? Why are people so inclined to believe that, and rather than criticizing or questioning their own beliefs?
Yeah, so I think it's connected to what we were talking about earlier with these social identities and how so often we form these very narrow sets of social identities that provide us with so much of our self esteem and how we see ourselves. And we've become more and more isolated as a society where even though the information available to us online, we can connect with so many different people, we still tend to find people who think like us and get media that affirms what we like. So there's this echo chamber effect and also just this idea of how, again, especially in the United States, we see a lack of opportunity for those to interact with their communities. And this has been studied by people like Robert Putnam, a sociologist who had that famous book Bowling Alone, where he talks about how more and more people are doing activities alone, such as bowling or just not joining these voluntary organizations as much, and there's not as much
Right.
community social interaction. And I think that's a big part of it, because ideally, to protect ourselves from misinformation, we would want to have a broad set of social identities so we're not so vulnerable to believing something that makes us feel like our entire sense of self is attacked. Because
Yeah.
if all of our identities are so connected and everything is, in a very narrow set of how we view the world, then any information that conflicts with that feels like the worst thing ever, and we're super motivated to protect it. So if we can meet lots of different people who think differently, and we interact with our neighbors and see that they're, not our enemies, then we're much more protected against these misinformation campaigns and just seeing false information online.
So you don't think that like being a troll and chasing down liberals or conservatives and being like, "Hey, you're stupid," is the way to get access to these other ideas?
No, not particularly. Yeah, I mean, a lot of social media discourse is unproductive
Yeah.
as far as the trolling. Um, and there's even some research on this. Like, just the mere exposure to an opposing viewpoint online can actually make you more polarized,
Mm,
because it's not necessarily a meaningful debate you're having, a
right.
meaningful conversation. It's just like exposing you to something that you don't like and will make you mad.
I know, like my own experience with like commenters, even that might sort of agree with me on YouTube or on social media. I tend to just ignore them
Mhm.
by and large because it comes across as trollish. So then why am I engaging, right?
Sure. And yeah, I mean, there's definitely people who, there's a subset of people who just enjoy trolling. And at that point, there's no point in talking with them, because they literally are trying to get a response and are not interested in dialogue. But also just the idea of how social media, you're behind a computer screen and it's just very easy to say something kind of mean or snarky, and
Yeah.
you have a limited amount of time and energy, and you're like, well, do I want to engage with this person who's kind of being a jerk, or not? It's like, you probably don't want to. So even if, yeah, like you said, you might agree with them, you only have so much time and energy to engage with different people, so you might want to spend it on people where you think it's more productive.
Yeah. Which I guess can just drive us farther and farther into kind of our own little echo chambers. But
For sure.
yeah. I guess I'm curious about your thoughts on like the Zuckerberg thing that just happened like last week or whatever it was.
Hmm.
Like so they're not doing fact checking on Facebook anymore. And now it's going to be a community notes kind of situation like it is on Twitter or
Hmm.
X. So
Yeah.
I'm curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so they've changed their fact checking to be more crowdsourced, or entirely crowdsourced now, instead of providing these labels from independent fact checking organizations. It's still unclear exactly how it's going to work. Like, the details are really important for this, so it's hard for me to have too strong an opinion on before I really know how they're going to do these community notes, because there's actually some research showing that crowdsourced fact checking can be very effective.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's politically balanced and if it's done well, it can result in accuracy scores similar to professional fact checkers. So, like, the wisdom of crowds, as long as you have some guardrails on it, can actually be pretty good. And people tend to even trust the wisdom of crowds a little bit more
Right.
sometimes than fact checking organizations. So I'm a little bit agnostic on that change. I I'm more bothered by the what that means for like these fact checking organizations that do a lot of good work.
Right.
Like, their funding might be cut; they were kind of thrown under the bus, and it's important to have these people on the ground trying to analyze claims, so people who are interested in looking stuff up can actually do so. So this is
Yeah.
around the globe. There's all kinds of fact checking organizations that try to debunk stuff, and now that Meta is no longer partnering with them, um, I don't know what's going to happen to them. It might
Yeah.
just be done.
Yeah. No, for sure. I know like I've seen many like people like dismiss Snopes or whatever as too woke, so then
Hmm.
forget it. And as a person who's farther left than like the Democrats, I see some of their stuff as pretty status quo, right? Like
Hmm.
PolitiFact is often one of these ones that I'm like, come on, like you didn't really analyze that. but but yeah, I still always look for those kinds of things because I always think of like the fact checking is pretty important. But
Yeah, and it's one tool, right? So like, one website isn't going to be perfect 100% of the time.
yeah,
I think consensus is really important, and ideally, we would have some sort of like combination of crowdsourced fact checking with professional fact checking, maybe even with like AI to help us like get it at scale. But that's really challenging once you add all these variables,
for sure.
and then you have to trust the corporations to actually do the right thing, which is a whole other issue.
My brain just went no.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can never trust them. But yeah, for sure, it's a tough situation to think that like I don't know, some people are just not going to be able to get access to true things. It seems like.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean that's the bummer side of it is it's taking away some of that extra speech. So it's not even like sometimes people conflate this with fact checking as censorship, and I don't think that's an accurate way to think about it because ultimately, with Meta, it was Meta making these decisions to downrank content or delete content. It wasn't the fact checking organizations. They were,
Right.
they don't have the power. They're not the $1 trillion company. So it was just offering more information for people who wanted it. And now that is going to be replaced with this crowdsourcing, which again, it could work as a way, when you look at all of the net positive and negatives, it might come out as a wash as far as the actual impact. Um, but, fact checking definitely always has limitations, and a lot of people won't trust fact checks, and fact checks are retroactive, like they come in after the fact, like something can
Yeah.
be spread and lots of people will see the viral misleading post, and then far fewer people will see the fact check anyway.
Yeah, and then you get like sometimes like the New York Times or some legacy media that is supposed to be fact based will say something that's false, and then
Right.
they'll that'll get everywhere, and then they'll put a little blurb at the end that's like, no, this particular part is actually false, and nobody ever sees that ever again.
Right. Exactly. So I I appreciate fact checking. I think it's a very valuable tool. I think we should, as a society, celebrate fact checkers and people trying to critically evaluate stuff. I am personally skeptical of the widespread impact they have. Um, because there's studies that show that they help on a population level, like big picture. If you do a bunch of studies and you show people misleading stuff and then show them fact checks, like people do overall move towards having a more accurate position that aligns with these independent fact checking groups. But it's a small effect, and people in certain demographics, certain political perspectives are less likely to trust certain sources. So the overall net impact is limited.
Mm.
And I think it's more about trying to instill values of critical thinking and having a diverse set of social identities that matter more for combating misinformation than any sort of fact checking approach or any sort of decision made by a corporation.
I'm reminded actually of a relatively recent blog of yours on Substack, on your Substack, about how to have these conversations. And there was, I think, the 5 points, and like there's like the respectable or respectful. I can't remember the rest, but it was interesting to see like that there is perhaps a way to have conversations with people you disagree with that
Mhm.
can find a common ground, or maybe you can convince them of your perspective.
Yeah, yeah. So I break down these 5 steps that the goal is to increase your chances of being heard. It's not even so much like changing minds or trying to get them to update their beliefs. It's removing those defensive biases that prevent the other person from shutting down and just not even hearing what you're saying. And these 5 steps, just to briefly go through, and the first one's mutual respect. So that's a huge one for just trying to at least remove those psychological barriers that can happen. So it's like, okay, I talk about some things I can work on, but that's the first one. So you get mutual respect. Then you can start thinking about applying these psychological principles that can help make the conversation more productive. One of them is trying to relate to a shared identity. So it's not even so much finding common ground about a political issue. It's just turning down the heat and the polarization of viewing each other on totally opposing camps.
Right.
This is something that I think is important for people who are politically active. I feel strongly that your average Democrat and your average Republican have far more in common with each other than the average Democrat and Republican billionaire, for example.
Yep.
You're hating on your neighbors for having a different political persuasion than you, but you have so much more in common with them than the oligarchs in our country and other countries. So, that's like another kind of way to approach it. But the idea is like finding what you haven't, like you're both in this community, or you're both parents, or you both care about X or Y, and focusing on what you care about before you even dive into like complicated conversations.
I know my Marxist co-host on the Red Reviews portion will say, that's class. That's the thing we share.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so class is an identity. Like if you're, middle class, working class, like you have so much more in common, even if you disagree on politics. And it might seem like you don't because of, propaganda and if you're in these echo chambers. But that's definitely a big one. And then trying to reframe the conversation to focus on things they might care about. So there's research showing that people might care about certain policies if they're framed in a way that resonates with the values they have. If someone's, pro-liberty, pro-freedom, you can talk about the issue in those terms, for example, which a lot of people are. So that's a good starting part for like a shared value. And then also just the language we use when we have these conversations. I think it's very productive to ask about the step-by-step mechanism of how they came to a certain belief or conclusion instead of just asking why. Mm-hmm. So if you just ask someone like why you like Donald Trump or why you like Joe Biden, they can just easily say, I think they're a good guy, or whatever. And it kind of shuts down the conversation. But instead, if you focus on that step-by-step mechanism, like how do you, first off, how confident are you that this particular policy is good? And and then how did you come to that conclusion? Walk me through the steps and the evidence of why you think this is the case. So it's not just a binary of right and wrong. It's more of a spectrum and a mechanical approach to conversation. And finally, the last step is repeat. Is all this stuff is very challenging, difficult, and requires an ongoing source of time and energy. So it's tough.
For sure. I often I've talked to people about how you're much more likely to gain ground in your conversations with somebody that you have an established relationship with. If your coworker, your parent, your relative, even the relative that you might want to write off because of some of their terrible takes,
right.
If you want them to not have terrible takes, you're the one that's probably the most likely to reach them. Rather than writing them off, maybe put in some of this effort and you can actually improve things.
Yeah, for sure. The closeness of ties will make a big difference. But it's challenging, like so many things. If you're personally affected by one of the policies they really like, then you might not want to debate, your fundamental human rights with them. And that's totally fine.
For sure.
It can be challenging.
No, for sure. It's one of those things. Yeah. You don't want to sacrifice your own humanity, I guess, in a sense, to be hey, yeah, no, let's discuss this in whether or not I'm a human being.
Right.
So, yeah, it's yeah, it's easy for me to say as somebody who my worst identity is like just that I'm politically not in any of the camps. So, but yeah, I guess we're getting closer to the end, but you have a book and a podcast that's going to be starting here, so we better talk about these.
Yeah, happy to do so. So my book is titled Misguided. It will be coming out early this summer. I'm getting the proof soon, so it's coming. Like, it's on the website. So it's on the it's published through Columbia University Press. So it's like on there. It's real. So that's pretty cool to see it like actually
right
on the internet. And it's all about why we believe misinformation from a social and psychological perspective. So a lot of what we talked about already, honestly, is kind of the high level, what I tackle in the book as far as social identities and social networks, and explaining how that creates our susceptibility to misinformation and what steps can we do to protect ourselves. And then I talk also about social media in general, artificial intelligence, as well as media and digital literacy. And I think all of those play a role. So I try to really take a broad perspective in the book, where I cover the micro level as well as the macro level. So talking about not only the social and psychological factors of how we process information, but also broader things like, how do institutions regain trust? And how do we think about social media in a way that can make it healthier for everyone? And I think that's the interesting part that I hope is in my book is I take this interdisciplinary approach, but also this multi-level approach to trying to understand misinformation.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's is it going to be like kind of like an academic book, or is it kind of like a like, could I read it?
Yeah, definitely. So like I mentioned, it's published through a university press, which are typically more academic, but I really appreciated my publisher was very open to me making it more accessible. So cool. I tried to make it high level and not jargon filled. Like, there's a ton of psychological literature that I talk about. Like, I mentioned a ton of studies. So as I was rereading the final proofs, I was like, okay, like I kind of really get into the weeds about some of the nuances of some of these, some of this research on social media and social identities. But I still think, so it can be a good academic resource, but I also think it's good for anyone interested in this. So I tried to kind of do both. Hopefully I did a good enough job. I guess I'll find out soon what people think about it.
Well researched, but accessible.
Yeah, that's what I was going for.
Right on. No, for sure. And your podcast, it hasn't started yet?
Yeah, so I started recording, but it hasn't officially launched yet. It's also the same title, Misguided, the podcast. I'm kind of just leading into that framing, and it's about similar topics, but broader. So I focus on misinformation in my book and in some of my most recent research. And in this podcast, I'm going to interview a bunch of people involved in the misinformation space more broadly. So people who are lawyers, psychologists, science writers, a more diverse group of folks interested in debunking things and talking about misinformation in a variety of spaces. So I hope that it's interesting. It's kind of an experiment to see how much people are really interested in learning about misinformation, because it's a bit niche. Right. But like I said at the beginning, how I approach misinformation is really more about how we are biased by these social and psychological forces. And that's kind of the big picture of even the word misguided, is that we're guided by these social and psychological forces, and sometimes they misguide us when we analyze information. So really thinking about bias and critical thinking in a social science lens is the high level approach to the podcast.
Oh, that sounds very cool. I don't know about other people, but that is a particular interest to me. Like, obviously I came out of the skeptical community and I have all these books on how beliefs are formed and like, it was like a big part of my learning for like probably 10, 12 years. So I'm looking forward to it.
All right, great. One listener. That's good.
Yeah, at least one. Yeah.
At least one. Okay,
yeah,
cool.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess the only thing really left is like, where can people find you online?
Yeah, so my podcast will be coming out soon. It should be available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Substack, YouTube. Going to try to push it everywhere. Hopefully, like I said, I have a couple episodes recorded already. I'm just getting them out by hopefully in the next couple weeks. So that's Misguided the podcast, and I've Misguided the newsletter, which is my Substack. So I'll be publishing the podcast on there, but I also write up summaries about my own research that I cover in written form. And I'm pretty active on Threads and Blue Sky. Those are my preferred social media these days. So if you want to follow my work and my thoughts on stuff, that's where I'm at.
Right on. Yeah, I'm on like all the social media, but I'm thinking about leaving Facebook and I'm thinking about leaving Twitter, but I don't use them as much, and there's better stuff going on in other places.
Yeah, I think there's some alternatives. It's tough, like if you want to create content, you kind of want to share it with people, and
yeah.
I think Blue Sky is has some potential there because it's kind of decentralized, but there's still support behind it.
Yeah.
So we'll see. It's going to be interesting to see how this space evolves in the next few years.
What do you think of the people that say that it's the Truth Social of the Democrats?
I mean, it certainly has a left-leaning slant, as does Threads. So like, I'm not going to pretend that it's somehow unbiased. I like that it's on a decentralized protocol, and you have a lot of customizable options for how you use it. And, as these platforms grow, they're going to become more politically diverse. Like I know with Threads, like at first it was basically everyone who didn't like Elon and Twitter. So it was like very niche. And now it's grown to the point where I do get conservative people talking to me and trolls. And so I get to see that evolution. So, as things grow, we see a more diverse group of people.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't have that many followers on Threads, so I still don't get the trolls yet, but I'm starting to get some on Blue Sky.
That's good.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time, and I appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a lot of fun chatting.
All right, folks, that's all for now. Thanks for watching or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends or on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. I really appreciate it, and it helps me keep the power on. Thanks to my top patrons, Damian Marie Athope, Some Random Geek, Justin Clark, Dan F. Smith, and Lisa Glass. And thank you to my new patrons. You can stay tuned for the list of patrons at the end to see your name listed. If you aren't a patron and want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can send a one-time donation to buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. I also have a Substack where you can subscribe for free or you can donate per month. And lastly, you can get a paid subscription on Spotify that will give you the same access to bonus content and extra long episodes. If you can't contribute financially, then a like on YouTube or a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check out the show notes for links to all my stuff, or check out my link tree. It's linktr.ee/skepticalleftist. That's where you can find all of my social media spaces and communities. You can also email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening or watching. Make sure to leave a comment on the video, join your local org, print off some posters or pamphlets, and spread the propaganda.